Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to say I'm here with Christopher Patno from Google. Hi, Christopher.
Right.
We're going to be talking about the European Accessibility Act. It's a year until it becomes fully integrated into different laws in different countries across the EU. Right now, there's loads of detail out there that we're all trying to get to grips with. It's a looming deadline with 101 different variations depending on where you are and what you're doing, which countries you're in, which technologies you're working with. The legal advice you've had or not had so far will be guiding you in certain directions. I know that Christopher's been talking about the EAA for some time. It's been on his radar for 5 years at least, I think. So not only are you someone we can check in with and talk about the big picture, but of course, the small matter of how many Google products and services might need to be checked and adapted, and all the different variations from your point of view of the different products and services that Google has in the European market. But I think at the core of it is your own sort of version of this as well. I think that what the people we're talking to are people in a role like yours. They're responsible for accessibility. They're trying to work out which levers and strings and buttons to press to keep everybody moving in the same direction at the speed that's needed. So we will talk about some of the basics of what the law could potentially say in all these different 27 countries. But I think it's really, I'm trying to sort of find out how you've navigated so far through this maze, and also some of the top tips you've got for people who maybe haven't quite got as far along that route yet. And then obviously looking ahead, what's it, if we were sitting here in 2 years' time, how many of those hairs will you have pulled out? For what particular reason? Will you be looking like me instead? So that's a general scene, a general picture. And of course, anything else that you want to throw in around the EA, because it's such a hot topic and clearly central to the work you're doing. So there's not going to be many people watching this who don't know who you are, but could you just briefly introduce yourself and say a little bit about your role within Google?
Yeah, so my name is Christopher, and I am the head of EMEA, Accessibility and Disability Inclusion for Google. I moved to the UK in 2021 because of the European Accessibility Act. In mid-2020, I realized that we weren't paying attention, and we probably should. So I pitched my job to come to Europe to get us ready. And I was right. We weren't doing much then, but we're doing an awful lot more now.
Cool. And your background in terms of accessibility is not just within Google, of course. There's other areas where you've had, or certainly in more generally in terms of digital. Could you just say a little bit about where that came from, because that might well inform some of the sort of perspectives you have about how to make these changes happen.
Sure. So I started doing accessibility inside Google, but in past lives, I was at Apple for 10 years working on the G4 towers and G5 towers and iTunes. I've made mobile devices for Sony. I've made games at Disney. So I feel like I was kind of in my element because the EAA has its influence over so many areas, whether it's computers or operating systems or smartphones or mobile banking. There's a list of products that they talk about that need to be accessible. But what I found very interesting is where it doesn't. So I guess number one advice is talk to your legal team so you can be clear what their definition, their meaning the EU, what the EU definition of product is, because it might be different than yours. And I've been surprised a couple of times. I had a more inclusive view of what I thought was influenced and impacted, and I've been corrected several times because my definition was different than what was in the documentation.
Interesting. And I mean you've picked up straight away one of the top tips that we're offering to people is, if this is a subject you're coming to for the first time, two sides to what you said really. You should find the documentation will be very complicated. It is extensive. It has a whole range of moving parts that do or don't connect in quite the way that you want them to. So if you're looking in on this for the first time and finding it a bit bewildering, then that's because it is a bit bewildering. There's a lot to it. There's a lot going on there. You're not the only one. And then the other side, you've mentioned talking to the legal teams, and we're saying really generally, if you haven't done that yet, it's going to be one of the only ways you can really establish whether it covers you. And from a UK company point of view, it's still not clear that just because you're a UK-based company, that as far as you're concerned, you only have UK-based consumers or customers, that still doesn't exempt you from any of the other broader principles of the Act, particularly in the supply chain, particularly in relation to customers from outside the UK that can use your services and so on. So the way that it's set up is not simple to navigate, and it's quite difficult to tell from the outside whether it applies to you or not. Just in terms of getting legal advice, which I assume that you started that journey a little while ago, what was the sort of first impressions you got when you started talking to the legal team? Were they alert to this? Were they aware of its existence? Did they have it on their radar?
It depends on who you talk to within the organization. Google is a pretty big company. So we had some people that were very aware of it, and we had other teams that were more, say, US focused, even though the product was global. They're more focused on the US issues because that was a bit closer to home. Everyone had heard of it. The interesting question is the ROI question. How bad is it really? Um, and it's a reasonable question when you're talking to that middle manager layer who is making the decisions of this feature over that feature, this bug over that bug. They decide what gets done. So you need to be able to have an answer of what's the risk, what's the likeliness of the risk, what's the severity of the risk, and you need to do that in conjunction with your legal team because we the accessibility professionals want it to be everything. Give me everything. Realistically, that can't happen. So you need to walk that prioritization process carefully and thoughtfully.
Hmm. And within that process, have things changed as you've got closer to the detail? I'm wondering whether the risk is perceived to be greater at the beginning, and then you start pulling back the layers and realize, oh, actually, this is fine. You know, this bit here is okay, but and vice versa. That something that looks relatively straightforward, as you start to work towards the detail, you realize that it's exposing a whole range of different issues that you hadn't thought of. I'm guessing it's a bit of both over time.
I think it is. What was interesting is we started off just looking at the EU uh, declaration as the basis. And then we had to start pulling apart each member state's different implementation of it. And some of them have a fine of money. Ireland has allegedly a fine of jail time. That gets people attention. How likely is it to happen? So you could open the door with jail time, but they might not pay attention when they realize it has to be so egregious that it's not likely to happen. So again, this is why you want to partner with your legal team, but also you want to make sure that you focus with the people that understand the laws in these different member states, because the declaration is not everything. And also, if I may, so many of us are so used to just talking about WCAG. Well, the EN 30549 standard is a completely different standard, and you need to find where those gaps are for your product. You may be 100%, well, no one's 100%. You may be AAA compliant in 2.1. It doesn't mean you're going to be compliant in terms of EN 30549. So there's work to do there in terms of understanding the gaps between where your product is. Even if you're killing it in terms of WCAG, there may be things that you have to think about, especially if you have these broader products, that might be important.
Hmm. And you've mentioned that the products there. Can you give us a sort of a sketch of the 4 or 5 products that Google sells in Europe? I don't think there's many. Is there half a dozen, maybe?
Two or three, actually. There's these little thing called Android phones, and there's Chromebooks as operating systems. There's payment services, and how you define payment services depends on what your legal counsel will say. We have ebooks, so there's a number of things that we have to take care of. Oh, and there's this audio visual media service with this group called YouTube, you might have heard of. There's a bunch of these products at a company like ours. We have so many products.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting challenges we have is how do you put together that list of all of the products that are actually in line? And that's been an awful lot of work because only someone who knows the product inside and out and the entire sort of catalog of products in a given product area, only they know all of the products that are there. No central team like ours knows everything about every product in all of Google. So we have to lean on the product teams and we have to guide them to help them make the right decisions and help them make the right assessment. But it's their responsibility to tell us what products are in scope, and then together we can work on helping them come up with a mitigation plan if needed.
And do you have an estimate of how many lines there are in that spreadsheet listing them? I mean, is it
Many.
beginning to come together?
It's a big spreadsheet, let's just say.
Yeah. In terms of the complexity, are there big differences between, say, software and hardware? You've mentioned, one of each different types, and also other informational services that sit in the middle, and the payment services. I'm just thinking of people listening in, trying to tune into how many different things it may affect. I mean, obviously, Google does sell hardware and it does sell software, but and so there's two distinct areas. Did you find much grey area in between that you hadn't expected, where it was somehow not quite so clear, like the payment systems? Or did
I think e-commerce is an example. Is
Yeah,
what if you sell something in another application? Then that's an interesting question of whose responsibility is it? Is it the application who is the person talking, the application talking to the user, or is it the payment service that they're using? So there's an interesting org chart challenge which with large companies that you need to work through. Is sort of the dependency graph of a large application. No
yeah.
one team does everything for all of it. They take code from different parts of the business. So understanding that dependency graph of who needs to do what work and make sure that it's agreed to in time for them to finish their work and then time for you to wrap it up and put it into your application. There's an interesting engineering challenge. But first you have to decide that you're in line. And then you have to figure out what part of your architecture is actually in line, and then who gets the fun of doing the work.
And I guess that when you talk about product managers, just to unpack that a little bit, those are the people who are responsible for the delivery of the whole thing into the marketplace, within which they have 101 competing priorities, as you say. I mean, how easy is it talking to those people about accessibility? Are they aware of it, or are you doing a bit of a 101 job before you begin the EAA, even bringing the accessibility story to life before you talk about the legislation? How does that play out?
Yeah, I'm lucky that we've been on this accessibility journey for many years. So everybody that comes in is trained about accessibility. They have an
Right.
understanding, they know the nouns, the verbs, the expectations. We have corporate-wide expectations for many of our products. So it's just the language of accessibility is understood and known. What we need to do is anytime there's new legislation, whether it's in the US or the UK or the EU, we need to make sure that they're aware of it with enough time to be able to react to it. Because WCAG is often turning, there's new legislation coming in around the world. This is a process that we've built, but this is just a
Yeah.
bit more intense because it's so broad in so many spaces. And an example, though, our hardware team, they've been dealing with the CE markings forever. They just said, okay, tell me what's the new stuff we need to keep track of. And we'll just do it because this is what we do. So for some teams, it could be just business as usual, just with a couple new things they have to track. Other teams, it can be a completely new way of thinking about how to do things because of some feature that they connect into European Accessibility Act. I'm sort of making this up, but I think you know where I'm
Yeah,
trying to
yeah,
go.
yeah.
So it'll be easier for some than for others.
And in terms of the sort of global perspective, the teams you're talking to are essentially responsible for the whole product in the whole planet. So how do they measure up these sort of standards against each other? When you mentioned WCAG, they already have that in their mix. Then you have all the EN requirements. Is that how they're going to be looking for the highest sort of level that they have to aim for? Is that their starting point? That plus that. Okay, I've got to get that little bit further.
That's generally how we do this, and it's not just for the EN 301 or WCAG. There's other legislation that comes in around the world that we have to pay attention to. So again, we're lucky because we're such a big company. We have some of these infrastructure set up, but the flip side is we are such a big company. We need to keep track of all of the people paying attention to all of these changes that we've gotten good at tracking.
Yeah. And so I was wondering on that basis, to what extent the EAA is going to raise the benchmark in your experience so far. Are you finding that that what's already being tracked contains most of the things the EAA is bringing into the picture? Is it setting a radically different standard, or is it sort of, sometimes yes, sometimes no?
I think what the legislation doing is it is giving us an easier story to tell. It makes it easier for us to say why it's important because legislation's coming. In the US, they have the American with Disabilities Act, and it's not been particularly well enforced. Some of the rules don't have any teeth. So rules without teeth are useless. Here we see 17 different mouths with different kinds of teeth. We don't know whose teeth are going to be the sharpest or which teeth have have the most bites. So we have this interesting opportunity that they're paying attention. Teams know that they have this additional work that they have to do. So now we can lean on them and help them be successful.
Cool. And you're looking at this with a global perspective, but you're sitting in the UK and just in terms of where you're based, and then you're looking at the EU, but you're also doing, Middle East and Africa. To what extent is this patchwork coming together with the European Accessibility Act in the middle? Is this the standout point at the moment that is really driving the change? I don't know of others in other territories, but is it really pushing that standard up because it's the one that's right center stage?
I think it's pushing the conversation because it's the newest. It's broad. It's extremely broad. There's the opportunity to lose the right to sell your product in a country, and some of these countries in EU are big. France and Germany, Spain, Italy. These aren't small countries, and losing the right to sell product would have a business impact, and that matters. But just because, say, Kenya has EN 301.549 as its standard, they're not really enforcing it yet. So the work that we're doing here for Europe is also going to actually make it easy for us to do work in Africa in the future and other countries as Canada just took EN 31549 as their standard. So the work that we're doing here for the EU is going to make our lives easier in the future because of this standardization.
And is that how the product managers see it? You're talking about the middle management and some of the issues that they have to deal with. I mean, what sort of tips do you have for an accessibility person going and talking to a product manager? Where have you found it easiest to begin the conversations? What sort of obstacles have you run into that you now avoid if you're going into those conversations fresh? Because I suspect that every accessibility professional listening in now knows they have to go and talk to somebody who's a product manager about their product, about all of these rather complicated and often quite arcane regulations which they've not encountered before. So what experience have you had that you think others could benefit from in terms of those conversations?
Partner with your legal team. Yet again, here we go. Work with them to understand the real risk. It's if you go in saying, bam, 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 you have to pay attention. Look at me, look at me. This is the whole world's going to fall apart. If you have no data to support it, it's not going to really help. So come in armed with the real data of the impact, and that's both, are you impacted and the severity of impact. Come in with that so you can have an honest conversation. Don't blow it up too big because you lose credibility later. It might be easier now, but your life will be harder in the future. So come with data. Be cooperative. Don't yell. Don't be grumpy or don't think this is my one big chance, so I'm going to get everything that I want. Come in a cooperative way, because you have to realize that there's a year between now and when it's enforced. What we don't know is what happens after that year mark. What happens on the 1st of July of 2025? Is everyone going to come and sue anyone who's inaccessible? Probably not. The EN 31549 standard is being adapted. Will countries just wait for the new standard to come out and say you have to do that? We don't know a lot about what's happening in terms of enforcement. So it's hard to have a real heart-to-heart conversation with someone who's choosing between today's challenge and tomorrow's challenge, but you can't clearly define what tomorrow's challenge is. So come in armed with data, but be practical and reasonable, that they have things that they need to do, but get them to agree that this is something that we need to do. So come in with the lawyers, with an understanding of what it means. Have the conversation of, yes, you're impacted, and then ask to do the scoping exercise. You're not asking them to fix it. You're asking them to tell, okay, let's see how much work we have to actually do. That's a really great place to start, because you've already got them agreeing with you. They know it's a risk and they want to know more. They can't commit to anything until they know what they have to do. If you can leave that meeting with a commitment to do a scoping exercise, you've done a really good job.
So diving into detail there, you've just, I mean, as an example, how would you answer the question about which standards and what to test against in terms of doing the scoping? The advice we're offering at the moment, for example, is that WCAG is the best you can do to begin with. So when you're talking about scoping, check it out against WCAG. Obviously, the EN may have a particular, you may well have already spotted in the legal elements, there may be an element of the EN regulation documentation which does relate directly to that particular product. Is that the way that you're playing it at the moment? We don't yet know exactly what to test it against. Sometimes we do. But when you're scoping it out, presumably WCAG is your baseline plus anything you could immediately see. And are you doing that testing internally, that scoping and checking? Do they have their own capabilities and they have access to those resources already? So it's just not a burden, it's not an additional burden for them.
Oh, it's certainly an additional burden because we don't have people just sitting around waiting for something to do. So
No.
Even getting into the prioritization and the scoping exercise, that is still something that needs to be scheduled in.
Right.
But exactly that. Hey, if you haven't done a recent test on WCAG, test with WCAG. Here's some new features that we need to pay attention to that we already know of because of the EAA, like the audiovisual media services. Fortunately, YouTube has captions, but if you're shipping a product that doesn't have captions, that's something you should probably get doing now because it's going to be required. Better to know this with a year to go than 3 months to go.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to end with a couple of things. One is when you're talking to people about the thing that's happening in a year's time, what are you thinking beyond that point? So you've mentioned it a couple of times that there's going to be some uncertainty and a very pragmatic approach you're taking. Do you think we, the community, should be thinking about the 1st of July 2025, or are you sort of leapfrogging that a little bit and thinking, okay, well, it's going to be 2026, 27, by which time you're starting to bring new features in, you've passed the deadline, bringing existing features in on the 28th of June is one thing, then you start building again and everybody can see that coming, that's when the real crunch is going to come. If you build something at that point, it's more likely to be in scope for legal. Are you looking at those timelines with the lawyers? Are you thinking about the medium and longer term game? And how's that impacting the conversations with the product managers? Because they're very short term focused, I guess, about the next sprint or the next build. How are you balancing that out?
Actually, exactly what you're saying. We're trying to help them understand the strategy of how to best optimize the schedule for the constraints.
Right.
Things are grandfathered in. If you've released beforehand, you have some time to make changes. So exactly as you say, you can use this to your advantage to give yourself a little more time if you have to. Best thing is just to get it done so you don't have to worry about it ever again. But that's not the reality of complicated systems and large systems. Things that we've been working on for 6 months already won't ship in a year from now at Google because our timescales of development are so large. Those teams need to do it now. But if you're building something that ships every quarter, you have a little wiggle room in terms of how you want these things to go out, and you can schedule these things a bit more thoughtfully. So it really depends on the nature of the technology, the nature of the product that you're building and trying to ship. Let me explain to you how we're doing this inside Google at a high level. So we have a central accessibility team, and we're the ones that sort of set the strategy, set the definitions, help with training. We are the ones that are sort of driving the overall analysis, and that we partner with each of the different product teams across Google and help them make the decisions in terms of what's important, what's at risk, and help them make their own decisions. We are focusing more with legal teams, accessibility analysts, experts in terms of statutes and standards and things like that, to create a common understanding of what we think these things mean. And then we'll share that across the company. And each team will have their own set of designers and engineers and their own accessibility experts and their own counsel to interpret what we're providing for them to apply towards their needs. So it depends on where you are in this circle of work. Someone needs to provide a common language, but then it's up to each team to consume it and see how relevant it is to what they're building.
Right, cool. And in terms of the last 12 months, a lot of preparation, a lot of awareness raising, a lot of sitting down in detail in front of planning and spreadsheets, presumably. Is it going to double in the next 12 months? Are people going to wake up and suddenly it's everywhere for you? Or do you feel it's a steady slope? What do you think about this shift as we go towards this really, finite deadline that we all carry around in our heads in the accessibility community? Do you see that having that effect, that ramping up effect?
I think it's likely. I think in the ideal world, you'd start today and you create your burn down and you finish it by the beginning of June 2025. But the reality is that's not how teams work usually. So I think there'll be parts that are quite linear and straight ahead, and Some of it will be dogpiling to get the most important things taken care of, and then a little bit of cleanup when you have time. I think it's going to be a little bit of everything, and I don't think in every company I've ever worked in engineering, it's always been that way for deadline. So this isn't anything new. This is really realistic. This is just a new deadline. You plan as best as you can, and you deal with reality when you hit it.
Yeah. Well, I'm always reminded of a phrase about going with the stones that roll. And rather than chasing after the endless cycle of trying to persuade somebody to get started, once they're started, they're on the road. And those are the people who need the most help, probably, I think. Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that you've given us a really great broad picture there, I think, of lots of issues that different people who are listening in are going to be grappling with. Clearly, the scale of what you're dealing with, both in a global sense and the range of products and the number of products and services, it's not unique to Google, but it's going to be unique in your role, probably amongst various people listening in. But that sense of working within the central team and setting the standards and then getting other people to implement that connecting in with the legal teams and making sure you've got them on board and not rushing at this, seeing it as the medium term and keeping moving and embedding good practice. I think they're all incredibly valuable lessons. So huge thank you for sharing that with us. And we'll be back to talk about it again. I'm sure we'll be talking about it at TechShare Pro in November. I'm sure we'll be talking about it again this time next year as this ramp goes up, as we start to engage more and more in this. But thank you very much for sharing all of that with us today, Christopher.
Oh, my pleasure, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.